So let's have a look at how forms are used in PHP. Now, if you've used the web at all, you'll know that we use forms all the time. It's a really common way of getting data from the user. Often you'll provide a kind of box for people to type values into. It could be in Google, or it could be, you search for something, like a search box. Let's have a look at a very simple form that we can create in HTML. Now, this form simply is going to ask you how many times you watch soaps in a week. So how many times you're going to watch soap operas in a week. And this is very similar to forms that you would see all the time. So the metaphor is we have spaces for you to type values in, and then we have a button, and we click the button when you have finished typing the values in. It's a very clear signal to the program that you've entered the values that you want the program to work on. So here we've got an input field, which is a text field. And this seems a little odd, but actually the button is also an input field, because what we're actually doing is we are clicking on it, and in a way that is providing an input to the form, this notion of the form. That's called a submit button here. So how do we define a form in an HTML file? Well, we don't need any PHP, and in fact forms are actually native in HTML. So I'm just going to go through the particular elements that we have in this HTML file. So if you look, you can see in the fifth line down, that's where the form begins. So forms always look like this, and we go form, we've got an opening form tag and a closing form tag. Remember what I said, there's no PHP here. Now we've got a number of attributes, and those attributes will change the way that the form behaves. The first thing that we do is we give the form a name. And so we have an attribute called name, and then we go equals something. And you remember with attributes it's always something equals something, name equals value. So here I'm going to use the name soap form as the name of the form. Next up we have this thing which is called action. What action does is it indicates the name of the page that will actually process the form results. So we will move away from this page to a subsequent page. We will travel to a page which will actually handle the data that's been entered into the form. And in this instance, the name of the page that we will travel to is going to be response1.php. And obviously the extension there indicates that that will be a PHP file. Now the third attribute that we have here is called the method attribute. And what we do with method is a way for us to actually pass information from the form to the subsequent page. And the method that we're actually going to use here is called get. Now what get does is get passes the information from the form through the URL. And you've probably noticed this going on, but perhaps you haven't really thought about it too much. I'll give you an example of how it works in a moment. There are actually two ways of passing information from the form to the page, but I'm just going to talk about get here. Let's go back to the form. I'll come back to get in a minute. Now, what about actual elements inside the form? Now, when I say an element, what I'm talking about is places where we can actually enter values into the form. Well, again, there are specific HTML tags that do this for us. So the first one that we have here is an input type. Now, input elements inside a form can be many different types of things. The first one is very straightforward. It's a text box. So we go input type equals text, and then what's really important here is that we give that box a name. And so we're going to go name equal times a week. Now I'm just making that up. Standard rules apply, don't put any spaces in there. Remember, this is HTML, it's not PHP. So I'm just going to make up a name for this form element, for this input box, and I'm going to call it times a week. Similarly then, I'm going to add a button, and this is where we go type equals submit. So that's a specific kind of form element that's going to put a button there for us. And again, I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it continue, and of course you could call it whatever you want. So I've got two elements on the form, and it's important that these elements all have a unique name, a distinct name. I've got an entry box, an input box, which is called times a week, and I've got a button called continue. Now, the reason that those names are important is, and this is how get works. Get will pass the values through to the next page using those names that we've just specified. So when we type a value in how many times do you watch a soap opera every week, that value will be associated with the name times a week. And when we click on the button, submit query, what will happen is that will also have a value that indicates that we've tapped on the button. And those are passed through in the URL using name value pairs. And again, this is something that you've probably seen but not really taken on board. So what you'll see is something that looks like this. Now, buried in here, this looks quite complicated, but actually buried in here is a number of different things. If you look at the far left-hand side, you can see we're calling the name of the page that's going to actually respond to our form. So the first thing it says is response1.php. And then after that, what get does is it wraps up all the bits of data using something equals something syntax. So if you look inside, just immediately after the question mark, you can see the first piece of data is times a week equals 4. Now, times a week is the name for the field that we made up. So you can see what it's doing is it's carrying that value forward, that value of 4, in that with that name, it's associating it with that name times a week. And what comes after that is the continue button. And you can see it's automatically got a default value here that's generated by the form submit and query. Now, let's just quickly go back to this bit about times a week. There's something extra special going on in there underneath the bonnet, which is if you type special characters in, what the HTML and HTTP standard does is it does sort of special encoding. I don't want to dwell on that too much here at the moment. There's a kind of encoding and decoding process going on underneath the bonnet. I'll just mention it here, but we'll talk about what actually is going on there later on in the course. So let's imagine that you've entered the values into the form and you've clicked continue, and those values have now carried forward into the response page. Now, what PHP does, and this is very elegant, PHP will create variables for each of the values from the form. And what it will do is it will use the name from the HTML form. And they're stored in this special variable called _get. And get is in capital letters. And we have to use this special notation. And this is actually an array notation, but we're not going to talk about that for a moment. So for now, just remember that you have to use this notation. $_get, square brackets, and then single quotes on the inside. And what we do is inside the single quotes, we place the name of the form element. So on our form, we called it times a week. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that value inside my PHP response page, and I'm going to put it inside times a week. Let's have a look at what that looks like in an actual PHP program. So let's just go through it slowly from the top. Right at the top, the first thing in our response page, what we're going to do is we're simply going to grab that value. So let's say that you typed in the number 4. 4 will travel from the form to our response page. What PHP will have done is it will automatically have created that get value in this special variable called _get, and it will use the name from the form, and the name from the form was times a week. So that's going to contain that value 4. So what I like to do is at the top of the page, I like to have a bunch of declarations where we just grab those values and we put them in a slightly more user-friendly variable. So I'm going to use the same name, and if you can use the same name, it helps just to maintain consistency between the form and the response page. So I'm going to grab that value times a week, and I'm going to put it in a variable called, well, why not, times a week. Remember that we put a $ on the front of the variable. And then down in the body of the program, we can do whatever we like. We could use that variable for doing mathematical calculations, we can do whatever we like. Here, all I'm going to do is I'm simply going to print it out. So we go print, the amount watched was, and then we can see I'm using that string concatenation operation, the dot, to actually print the value of times a week in that gap, inside that paragraph. So if we entered 4 in the form, what would happen is 4 would appear in that gap.